us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Muguland's freedom, our fire's inflamed. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lies. With Muguland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can.
Episode 1, Children of Anger, Echoes of the Fallen by Ope Banwo. The hidden sanctuary was aptly named. Tucked away in the dense forests that fringed the outskirts of the capital, it was a place few knew existed, a refuge for those who had no choice but to disappear. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, the canopy above casting the entire area in a perpetual twilight. It was here, far from the prying eyes of the government, that the seeds of the Igwerian Movement had taken root. A small group huddled around a makeshift table, their faces shadowed by the dim glow of a single lantern. These were the survivors, the remnants of the End Police movement, now hardened by loss and driven by a burning need for justice. Each of them bore the scars of the past year, some visible, others hidden deep within. But it was in their eyes that the true cost of their struggle could be seen, the cold, steely resolve that comes only from having lost everything. Beside him sat Adora Okoye, a fierce activist whose voice had once rallied thousands to the cause. She was thin, almost gaunt, but her spirit remained unbroken.
Her gaze was fixed on Chuk's Judo 4, waiting for him to speak to give them the direction they so desperately needed.
The others, Aga Adichie, popularly known as Aga Warrior, the tech genius who had kept their communications secure, Aminat Yahaya, the former journalist who had risked her life to tell the truth, and Uche Anozie, the quiet but deadly strategist, sat in silence, their expressions grim.
Each of them had lost friends, family, and loved ones to the brutality of the regime.
And each of them had sworn to see it toppled, no matter the cost.
No matter the cost.
Chinedu Ebubedike cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "We have to be smarter this time," he began, his voice low but firm. "What happened at Union Square can never happen again. We can't afford to lose more lives."
Adora nodded, her voice cutting through the gloom. "We've been underground for too long. The people are losing hope. They need to see us, to know that we're still fighting."
"And we will," Chinedu Ebubedike replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "But we won't make the same mistakes. This time we fight on our terms. We fight in the shadows, where they can't reach us."
Then Adora broke the quiet with a question that had been gnawing at her since the idea of a new movement first took shape. "But what kind of movement are we talking about?" she asked, her tone serious. "Are we going to have a formal leadership structure, or should we remain an informal movement, decentralized and leaderless?"
The room fell into a tense silence as the question hung in the air. It was a critical decision, one that could determine the success or failure of their cause.
"We need leadership," Chinedu Ebubedike said firmly. "The people need someone to look to, a figurehead who can unite them, give them direction. Without leadership, we risk chaos and disorganization. How can we mobilize effectively without a central command?"
Aga Warrior shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "Leadership makes us vulnerable," he countered. "If they know who's in charge, they'll target us. They'll find our leaders, imprison them, kill them if they have to. And once the leadership is gone, the movement could fall apart. A leaderless movement, one where each cell operates independently, is harder to destroy. The soul of the movement can't be compromised if there's no single head to cut off."
Adora nodded thoughtfully. Aga has a point. But without some form of leadership, how do we coordinate our efforts? How do we ensure that we're all working towards the same goal, rather than fragmenting into separate, ineffective groups?
Aminat leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "A leaderless movement has its advantages, but it also means that we lose the ability to inspire the masses. People need a face to rally around, someone who embodies their hopes and dreams. If we're just a collection of cells with no visible leadership, how do we gain the trust of the people? How do we show them that we're more than just a disjointed rebellion?
Uche, ever the strategist, spoke next. There's also the issue of messaging. A centralized leadership can control the narrative, ensure that our message is consistent and powerful. If we go leaderless, we risk losing that cohesion. Different cells might start pushing different agendas and the movement could lose its focus.
But central leadership also brings the risk of corruption, Aga interjected. How many times have we seen movements co-opted by the very system they sought to overthrow? Leaders become targets for bribery, intimidation, and worse. A decentralized movement can't be corrupted in the same way. It's adaptable, flexible, and can survive even if some parts are compromised.
Chinedu Ebubedike sighed, rubbing his temples as the debate grew more heated. Both approaches have their merits, but we can't afford to be divided on this. We need to decide, and we need to be unified in that decision.
The room fell silent once more, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Each of them knew the stakes, understood that there was no perfect solution. The arguments for both sides were compelling, and the choice was far from clear-cut.
After what felt like an eternity, Chinedu Ebubedike spoke again, his voice resigned but firm. It's clear that we can't reach a consensus on this. We all want the same thing, a better Muguland, free from tyranny. But we have different ideas on how to achieve it. So, we move forward with both approaches. Those who believe in a centralized leadership can work together, and those who favor a decentralized, leaderless structure can form their own cells. We'll pursue our goal in our own ways, but with the same ultimate aim.
Adora nodded slowly, though the tension in her expression remained. It's not ideal, but it might be the only way. We'll stay in communication, support each other where we can, but each group will operate independently.
Aga warrior exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Agreed. We'll be harder to stop this way, but we'll need to be more careful. Every cell needs to be disciplined, every action calculated.
Amenat and Uche exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. The decision had been made, and while it wasn't the clear, unified path they had hoped for, it was the best they could do given their differences.
We all know what's at stake, Chinedu Ebubedike said, his voice steady. We may be taking different paths, but our destination is the same. Muguland will be free of corrupt and incompetent politicians, and we'll make sure of it, no matter the cost.
The group slowly dispersed, each member lost in their thoughts. The hidden sanctuary, once a place of unity, now felt fractured, the weight of their separate paths heavy on their shoulders. But as they left, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the canopy, casting shafts of light onto the forest floor. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of a new beginning. A day when the blood of the innocents would no longer cry out in vain, but would be the foundation upon which a new Muguland would rise. The Igwerians were ready even if they were not entirely unified, and they would not be stopped.
Episode 2, Children of Anger, The Spark of Change by Ope Banwo. Muguland, once a beacon of hope and prosperity in the region, had descended into a state of decay. The air in the capital city was thick with the stench of corruption, poverty, and despair, a far cry from the vibrant, bustling metropolis it had once been. The streets were filled with the weary and the disillusioned, citizens who had long since given up on the promises of their leaders. The grand buildings that lined the avenues were now symbols of greed and power, towering over the crumbling infrastructure and the desperate souls who lived in their shadows. For years, the people of Muguland had watched as their leaders bled the nation dry, enriching themselves while the rest of the country suffered. The gap between the rich and the poor had widened to a chasm, with the elite living in fortified mansions while the masses struggled to survive in overcrowded slums. The once proud institutions of government had become tools of oppression, used to silence dissent and crush any attempt at change. The police, now feared as much as the criminals they were meant to stop, patrolled the streets with an iron fist, their brutality unchecked and their power absolute. Amidst this backdrop of hopelessness, a man named Paul Igwe, a name that would soon be whispered with reverence across the nation, was beginning to see the world with new eyes. A former governor of the Muguland state of Onitshaga, Paul Igwe was known for his straightforward simplicity, honesty, and prudence with state funds. His tenure as governor had been marked by a commitment to transparency and accountability, values that were all too rare in Muguland's political landscape. Under his leadership, Onitshaara had experienced a renaissance with significant improvements in education and healthcare, sectors that had long been neglected by previous administrations. Paul's approach to governance was a breath of fresh air in a system that had been suffocating under the weight of corruption for decades. He had slashed unnecessary expenses, redirected funds to vital public services, and held his administration to the highest standards of integrity. But his refusal to play by the established rules of Muguland's political elite had made him many enemies. The political establishment despised him for his honesty, viewing his straightforwardness as a threat to their carefully constructed networks of power and influence. Despite his successes, Paul's tenure as governor had been anything but smooth. He had been impeached twice, both times on dubious grounds, as the political establishment sought to remove him from office by any means necessary. Yet, each time he had fought back, taking his case to the people and winning their support. His resilience only deepened the respect and admiration that ordinary citizens had for him, but it also fueled the animosity of those in power. As Paul sat in his modest office overlooking the city, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had always believed in the potential of Muguland, in the power of its people to rise above their circumstances, but the years had taken their toll. He had seen the corruption firsthand, witnessed the way the powerful preyed on the weak, using the nation's resources to line their pockets while the people starved. He had tried to work within the system, to use his influence and resources to make a difference. But every attempt was met with resistance, every effort thwarted by those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The tipping point came when Paul attended a charity event in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. The event was meant to provide food and medical care to the needy, but as Paul arrived, he saw the true face of Muguland's suffering. Hundreds of people, many of them children, were lined up for miles, waiting for a chance to receive the basic necessities of life. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and the desperation in the air was palpable. As he handed out supplies, a young boy no older than 10 approached him. The boy's clothes were tattered, his frame emaciated, and his eyes filled with a sadness that no child should ever know. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "My mama says you're a good man. She says you help people like us." Paul knelt down to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's your name, young man?" "Chima," the boy replied. "My mama says we're lucky to have people like you, but she also says it won't change nothing." Paul felt a lump form in his throat as he looked into the boy's eyes that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Your mama is a wise woman, Chima, but she's wrong about one thing. We can change things. We just have to try harder." Chima smiled weakly, but there was no joy in it. "I hope you're right, sir." As the boy walked away, Paul felt a deep, burning anger rise within him. He had always believed that change could come through hard work, through persistence and goodwill. But now he saw the truth. The system was rotten to its core, and no amount of charity could fix it. If he wanted to make a real difference, he would have to do more, much more. That night, as Paul sat in his office, the lights of the city flickering outside his window, he made a decision that would change the course of Muguland's history. He would no longer stand on the sidelines, no longer play the game by the rules set by corrupt men. He would enter the political arena once again, not as a governor, but as a candidate for the highest office in the land. He would run for president of Muguland, not as a politician, but as a reformer, a disruptor, someone who would tear down the old order and build something new in its place. His decision was met with mixed reactions. While many of his loyal supporters from Onitshaara were thrilled at the prospect of him leading the nation, others were skeptical. Paul had always been a man of principle, but the forces arrayed against him were powerful and ruthless. Still, his message of transparent governance, accountability, and social justice resonated deeply with those who had grown weary of the endless cycle of corruption and repression. Paul's candidacy began to gain traction, particularly among the younger generation who had grown up in a Muguland that seemed to offer them little hope for the future. On social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, his supporters began to rally, using hashtags and organizing online campaigns to spread his message. They saw in Paul a leader who understood their struggles, someone who could bring about the change they so desperately needed. As the election campaign gained momentum, Paul's loyalists, a small but dedicated group, found themselves at the forefront of a burgeoning online movement. They defended him against the government's smear campaigns, countered the propaganda being spread by the state-controlled media, and worked tirelessly to ensure that his message reached as many people as possible. They were relentless, and their efforts did not go unnoticed. The ruling Agadongo party, sensing the growing threat, intensified its efforts to undermine Paul's campaign. They used every dirty trick in the book: intimidation, bribery, even attempts to disrupt his rallies. But the movement that had begun online was quickly spilling over into the real world, with more and more people joining the cause each day. While Paul had not initially set out to create a movement, one was forming around him nonetheless. The youth, particularly those who had been part of the End Police protests, began to see in Paul a figurehead for their frustrations and aspirations. The connection between Paul's candidacy and the broader dissatisfaction with the ruling party grew stronger, and soon the movement had a name. The press, initially skeptical, began to take notice. In a headline that would later become iconic, one newspaper referred to Paul's supporters as Igwerians, a nod to both his surname and the warrior-like resolve of those who backed him. The name stuck, and what had started as a loose coalition of online activists began to solidify into a powerful political force. Paul Igwe had become the reluctant leader of a movement that was growing by the day. He had not started the Igwerians, but they had found in him a symbol, a rallying point for their hopes and dreams for a better Muguland. The spark had been lit and the flames were spreading. The Igwerians were on the rise, and with Paul Igwe at their center, they were determined to bring about the change that Muguland so desperately needed.
Episode 3. Children of Anger, The Rise of the Igwerians by Ope Banwo. The aftermath of the End Police protests had left Muguland in a state of simmering unrest. The brutal crackdown on the youth, who had dared to demand an end to police brutality and a better future, had only fueled their anger. The government's attempt to silence dissent had backfired spectacularly, igniting a fire that spread across the nation. What began as a protest against a single issue had evolved into a broader movement against the corruption and repression that had plagued Muguland for decades. In the shadows of this growing discontent, a new force was emerging, a force that would soon shake the foundations of Muguland's political establishment. The youth, disillusioned by the empty promises of the ruling Agadongo party, were searching for a new direction, a new leader who could channel their anger into meaningful change. It was in this turbulent atmosphere that the Igwerians began to take shape. At first, the Igwerians were not a formal movement, but rather a loose network of individuals connected by a shared sense of frustration and a desire for something better. They communicated primarily through social media, where they could organize without fear of immediate repression. Twitter, in particular, became their battleground, a space where they could challenge the narratives being pushed by the state-controlled media and expose the corruption that had become endemic in Muguland. One night, in the midst of this digital rebellion, a Twitter space was created by a group of vocal activists, all of whom had played significant roles in the End Police protests. The topic was clear: who should we rally behind? The virtual room filled quickly, with thousands joining in, eager to hear and contribute to the discussion. The air was electric with anticipation, the sense that a decision made here could change the course of Muguland's future.
All right, everyone. We need to decide who's going to represent us. The elections are coming, and we can't afford to be leaderless. So, let's hear it. Who's our best bet?
A cacophony of voices immediately erupted, the sound of overlapping opinions creating a chaotic symphony of debate. But one voice, louder and more insistent than the rest, cut through the noise.
It's got to be someone who's already shown they're not afraid to stand up to the establishment. Paul Igwe is that man. He's been through the fire, twice impeached, and yet he stood firm. We need someone with that kind of backbone.
But is backbone enough? We're talking about taking on the whole system, not just one state. Paul's honest, sure, but can he handle the pressure on a national scale? This isn't Onitshaara.
A brief silence followed, the weight of Osa's words hanging in the digital air. But Kemi wasn't one to back down easily.
Paul has more than just backbone. He's got a track record. Education and health in Onitshaara were turned around under his watch. He didn't just talk, he delivered. What we need is someone who can do something, not just promise the world.
Dimeji chimed in, trying to steer the conversation. That's true. But we also need to think about how he'll be perceived. Paul isn't exactly young. Can he connect with the youth with us? Or are we going to end up backing someone who can't even tweet properly? A few chuckles echoed through the space, but the point was serious. The youth wanted someone who could understand them, who could speak their language and not just in sound bites.
That's why we're here, isn't it? Look at what we've done already. We've built this movement online. If Paul's going to be our guy, it's up to us to make sure he's speaking to the people where it matters, on the ground and online. We're the ones who can amplify his voice.
The space buzzed with agreement, but it was clear that not everyone was convinced.
Paul's not the only option. There are others who could take on the establishment, maybe even better than Paul. We need to weigh all our options, not just jump on the first decent candidate we see.
But who else has the guts? Who else has already stood up to the Agodongo party and lived to tell the tale? We don't have the luxury of time to groom someone new. Paul's been in the trenches and he's proven he's not for sale.
The argument grew more heated, voices rising as more people joined in, each bringing their own perspective and concerns. The discussion was passionate, intense, at times even contentious. But beneath the disagreements, there was a shared understanding. Whoever they chose, it had to be someone who could stand up to the immense pressure that would come with leading the charge against the deeply entrenched powers of Muguland. After hours of debate, the conversation began to coalesce around a common theme. The youth were tired of politicians who made promises only to betray them. They wanted someone who had shown, time and again, that he wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. Finally, Demeji, sensing the shift in mood, called for a vote. All right, let's do this. If you're for Paul Igwe, let's see it. We need to know if we're ready to rally behind him. The digital hands raised were overwhelming. Paul Igwe, with his history of defying the corrupt establishment, had won their trust. It wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Looks like we've got our man. Paul Igwe it is. But let's be clear, this is just the beginning. We're the ones who will make sure he's the voice of the people. We've got to be loud, we've got to be organized, and we've got to be relentless. As the Twitter space wound down, the mood shifted from heated debate to determined resolve. The Igwerians, as they were now calling themselves, had found their candidate. And more importantly, they had found their voice. A voice that would not be silenced, no matter what the Agodongo party threw at them. Days later, in a conversation with his inner circle, Paul reflected on the unexpected turn of events.
I didn't start this movement, but it seems they've decided I'm the one to lead it. We have to honor their trust. This isn't just about an election anymore. It's about a future they believe in, a future we owe it to them to fight for.
His advisor, an older man who had been with him since his days as governor, nodded. The youth are behind you now, Paul, but they'll expect you to be more than just a candidate. They'll expect you to be a champion for their cause. Paul looked out the window at the city below, the lights flickering in the distance. The weight of their expectations was heavy, but it was also invigorating. For the first time in a long while, he felt a renewed sense of purpose.
We'll give them a future they can believe in, and we'll do it together as Igwerians.
Episode 4. Children of Anger, the Formation of the Igwerians by Ope Banwo. With the decision to back Paul Igwe made, the next step for the Igwerians was to build a team that could take the movement from online debates to a formidable force in the streets and at the polls. The youth who had championed Paul's candidacy were determined to make sure that this movement wasn't just a flash in the pan. They wanted to ensure it had the depth, strategy and leadership needed to challenge the entrenched powers of Muguland. The first person brought into the fold was Udoka Naji, a brilliant but reclusive political strategist known in insider circles as the Ghost. Udoka had earned his nickname due to his ability to operate from the shadows, crafting intricate plans that often left his adversaries bewildered and defeated. His mind was a labyrinth of political maneuvers, and he had a reputation for being 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Paul had heard of Udoka through mutual contacts, but finding him was another matter entirely. Udoka rarely showed his face, preferring to communicate through encrypted channels, but when he finally agreed to a meeting, it was clear why he had been so highly recommended.
Your enemies think in straight lines, but will move like shadows, strike where they least expect it. They've never faced anything like this before.
Paul nodded, recognizing the steely resolve in Udoka's eyes.
I'm counting on you, Udoka. We can't afford any mistakes.
There won't be any. We'll be ghosts to them, and by the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late.
Next on the list was Bolu Yahaya, a young tech-savvy activist who had been instrumental in the digital mobilization efforts during the End Police protests.
I've always been known for my quick thinking and my ability to turn the tide of public opinion with just a few keystrokes.
Bolu was a master of algorithms, trends, and online communities, and he knew exactly how to harness the power of social media to build a movement. When Paul approached Bolu to join the team, Bolu was hesitant at first.
I had seen too many politicians promise change only to fall into the same patterns of corruption and neglect once they gained power.
But Paul's track record and the authenticity of the Igwerians swayed him.
Social media is our battlefield. We don't have the state-controlled media on our side, but we don't need it. We'll reach the people where they are, on their phones, in their feeds. We'll make sure they can't ignore us.
His plan was simple but effective. Bolu would oversee the digital strategy, creating viral content, organizing online campaigns, and ensuring that the Igwerians' message reached every corner of Muguland. His work would be crucial in rallying the youth and keeping them engaged throughout the campaign. While Udoka and Bolu worked behind the scenes, Adaora Okoye was a known face of the movement on the ground.
I've always been a passionate advocate for social justice.
Adora had been one of the most visible leaders during the End Police protests. Her fiery speeches and tireless efforts to rally support had made her a beloved figure among the youth.
I had always been skeptical of politicians, but Paul Igwe was different. I saw in him a genuine desire to change the system, and I knew that if anyone could challenge the Agadongo party, it would be him.
When she was asked to join the core team, she didn't hesitate.
We need to take this fight to the streets. The youth are ready, they're angry, they're motivated, and they want change. But we have to give them something to believe in. We have to show them that this isn't just another campaign, it's a movement.
Adaora's role was to organize grassroots support, holding rallies, town halls, and community meetings across Muguland. She would be the one to bring the Igwerians out of the digital world and into the physical one, ensuring that their message resonated with people from all walks of life. Finally, there was Tokunbo Olawale, or Tox, as he was known to his millions of followers on social media.
I've built my brand on a mix of humor, sharp social commentary, and a deep connection with my audience.
Tox had been one of the loudest voices during the End Police protests, using his platform to call out injustices and rally support for the cause. When the Igwerians reached out to Tox, they knew they needed someone who could amplify their message and make it resonate with a broader audience. Tox was the perfect choice.
We're not just changing minds, we're changing the culture. We need to make this movement cool, make it something people want to be part of. And we'll do that by staying authentic, by speaking their language.
Tox's role was to create and share content that would go viral, bringing the Igwerians' message to the masses. He would use his influence to shape the narrative, ensuring that the movement stayed in the public eye and continued to grow. With the core team in place, the Igwerians began to take their message to the people. Social media was their primary tool, but they knew that to win, they needed to mobilize on the ground as well. Adaora led the charge, organizing rallies and town halls in cities and villages across Muguland.
The rallies were electric, filled with passionate speeches, music, and the energy of a generation hungry for change.
The youth, who had long felt disconnected from the political process, were drawn to the Igwerians' message of transparency, accountability, and social justice. They came out in droves, ready to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Bolu's digital strategy was in full swing. Every rally, every speech was live-streamed on social media, reaching millions who couldn't be there in person. Hashtags like #Igwerians4Change and #PaulIgwe 2024 trended consistently, keeping the movement at the forefront of the national conversation.
Meanwhile, Udoka, true to his nickname, remained in the background, pulling the strings and ensuring that the campaign stayed one step ahead of the opposition.
He orchestrated surprise visits to key battleground states, coordinated with local leaders to secure their support, and made sure that every move the Igwerians made was calculated for maximum impact.
Tox, on the other hand, kept the movement fresh and engaging.
He hosted Twitter Spaces, posted daily updates, and even created viral challenges that encouraged people to show their support for the movement.
His influence extended beyond politics, making the Igwerians a cultural phenomenon as well as a political one. As the movement grew, so did the opposition's attempts to stop it. The Agadongo party used every trick in the book: smear campaigns, intimidation, even attempts to sabotage rallies, but the Igwerians were resilient. They had the energy, the strategy, and the numbers to push back against every attack.
What started as a loose coalition of disaffected youth had transformed into a well-oiled machine, with a clear mission and a powerful message.
The Igwerians were no longer just a reaction to the government's brutality. They were a full-fledged political force, ready to challenge the status quo and bring about real change in Muguland. And at the center of it all was Paul Igwe, the man who had become the symbol of their struggle. With the core team supporting him, Paul's campaign was gaining momentum, turning the Igwerians from a movement into a revolution.
us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't. They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Muguland's freedom, our fire's inflamed. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Muguland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can enslave. They say we're rebels, but we know we're right. Corruption crumbles when we unite. On social media, in the open streets, our voices thunder, refusing defeat. They throw us in cells, accuse us of treason, but we keep fighting, for we are the reason. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Muguland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We fight for the future, we fight for the land. With hearts full of fire, we make our stand. They can't break our spirits, they can't make us fall. In the name of Muguland, we answer the call. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbound, unbroken by the lights. With Muguland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We are the anger, we are the flame. For the love of Muguland, we'll fight in her name. With unyielding hearts, we'll carry the fight. In the dark of corruption, we'll be the light.